Let's now turn to Amnesty International. They've applied to be friends of the court in this particular matter and have been admitted thus, and it is, of course, an application to seek a declaratory order to force government to arrest Russian President Vladimir Putin should he attend next month's Brics Summit. The group's executive director, Shenilla Mohamed, joins us now for more. Shenilla, good to have you, and thank you very much for coming on. As I mentioned, the president making sure to tell those gathered there, including some of his Russian counterparts, that he is looking forward to hosting, as the host and as the chair of BRICS, a face-to-face physical summit of all the BRICS countries. Would that be a challenge for him? Politically, maybe in the country, but also legally and otherwise?
Good evening, Taban. Good evening to your viewers. I mean, you know, I think that definitely it's going to be a challenge for South Africa, because South Africa is basically legally, its international legal obligations really, mean that should President Putin come into the country, South Africa has to arrest him and hand him over to the International Criminal Court. They are obliged under international law as a member of the ICC. So, you know, it's going to be very interesting to see what South Africa does. I mean, as you said earlier, we've applied as Amnesty International to be an amicus curiae, which is a friend of the court, and really it's really, our role there would really be to, advise the court on international law and really what South Africa's obligations are under international law. And I think, we're very clear as Amnesty International. South Africa has got to arrest President Putin if he does come into the country. And if they don't, they are in violation not only of international law, but also of domestic law. So that's one of the reasons why we have applied for this. But it's going to be very interesting to see what South Africa actually does. Yeah.
So the President is saying in that affidavit, because, of course, international law and domestic law should be working hand in hand in a sense. He says, I must highlight for the sake of transparency that South Africa has obvious problems with executing the request of the ICC and surrendering President Putin. Russia has made it clear that arresting its sitting president would declare would be a declaration of war, and it would be inconsistent with our constitution to risk engaging in war with Russia. South Africa is not a warlike state, even though, of course, we have some arms to a certain degree. Would it be completely incorrect to say that the president is correct when he says there is a risk of war, of declaring war on Russia, should its sitting president be arrested? And therefore, as a president, he's got a constitutional obligation to address that possibility of war.
It's a very interesting argument that the state has put forward, an argument that should they arrest President Putin, it'll be a declaration of war. I mean, it'll be very interesting to see how the court reacts to this, because, the truth of the matter is that South Africa, whether they like it or not, they are obligated under international law and as members of the International Criminal Court to execute an arrest on President Putin. So, whatever reasons they come up with, I mean, yes, you could argue that South Africa does not want Russia to attack it, but it still has these obligations. And I think, what's so sad about all of this is that South Africa actually was one of the countries that was very instrumental in the setting up of the International Criminal Court 20 years ago. And, yes, while we know that the ICC is not perfect, but, it's all we have at the moment to ensure that, that the rights under international law are safeguarded. And should South Africa fail in this regard, then, South Africa it'll be a huge blow, not only to the reputation of South Africa, but also to its position on the Security Council, on the Human Rights Commission. And, South Africa shouldn't forget that it were these international laws that helped to some extent to break down apartheid. So while we may argue that, it's not a perfect system, but the truth of the matter is we need these systems of international law in order to make sure that people and leaders do not get away with impunity with regards to, criminal war crimes. And I think, Amnesty has documented a number, since the war began, we have documented war crimes in Ukraine. And, one of our roles as the friend of the court will be to, present the court with some of the evidence that we have gathered on the ground, which constitute war crimes, and really assist the court in understanding what South Africa's role is with regards to these war crimes and in alignment with international law.
Yeah. Brics being the focus this hour, President Cyril Ramaphosa having just delivered his keynote address at the Political Parties Plus Dialogue, Brics Political Parties Plus Dialogue Gala Dinner, mentioning, of course, some of the key areas of deliberation that will be taking place. And key to what he's mentioning there is the second pillar of conversation, which is multilateral joint action promoting peace, security, dialogue and negotiations. South Africa has taken that neutral stance when it comes to the Russia-Ukraine war, but the Democratic Alliance went to court, taking President Cyril Ramaphosa to say, court, please declare that the president needs to arrest Vladimir Putin, president of Russia, when he lands here for the Brics Summit in August. Joining that as friends of the court is Amnesty International South Africa, and we've got its executive director, Shenilla Mohamed, joining us. So the DA says, no, give us a declaratory order to say, arrest Putin when he gets into the country. The president says, I understand what you're saying, but hold on, my obligation in terms of the Constitution is to make sure that I protect the sovereignty of South Africa, the peace and security of the people of South Africa. So for me, that's a priority. I know you're saying Putin committed crimes of war in the Ukraine, but first and foremost for me, my obligation is to make sure that the people of this country are protected, they are safe, and they are secure. How do you advise the court, as the friends of the court, in what would be most important to carry out the Rome Statute, which have been, of course, ratified in the South African Constitution, or to protect the sovereignty of South Africa and the safety and the security of its people?
Well, Thabo, it's also important to know that, it's not just the Rome Statute that South Africa is accountable to, but it's also, if you look under the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, respect for the sanctity of human life, condemnation and rejection of impunity is one of the key objectives and key organizing principles of the Constitutive Act of the African Union, to which South Africa is also a party. So, in our role as a friend of the court, we will be, using our, we are an organization that really works on international law, and we will be using that experience to really, advise the court on what South Africa's obligations are under international law. But, this whole argument that, if we do fulfill the obligations that we are supposed to under international law, then we are putting South Africans in the country at risk of war. Well, there's a simple solution to that, Thabo. Then revoke the invitation. If you don't want to be put in that situation, then why are you basically inviting somebody who is a fugitive of the International Criminal Court, to which you are a signatory? Why are you inviting them to your country and putting the people of your country in danger? It's irresponsible as far as we're concerned. So, do what is right under international law and revoke the invitation, and, don't put South African citizens or South African people under threat of war, if that is a genuine concern that the president has.
Yeah. Interesting. I was watching that particular debate because I think it's the former public protector who Thuli Madonsela, also raised that very same argument, say, well, just revoke the invitation. And there are others who are arguing, well, it's not a unilateral decision, because Brics is not South Africa. Brics is a group of countries. It is Brics that is inviting Russia. Yes, South Africa is the host. So it's not as simple as saying, well, South Africa, just don't invite them.
Yes, Tabo, but there are other countries that have put forward themselves as possible hosts. I mean, I know, we understand China is one of those. And if South Africa genuinely does feel that it's a threat, of war with Russia, then, South Africa also needs to think about this. I mean, the truth of the matter is if a country is willing to go to war with one of the BRICS members, then, this is something that South Africa should really seriously be thinking about. I mean, should you have countries like Russia as part of BRICS if they are able, ready to go to war at the drop of a hat? Again, I think that, South Africa also, can't now turn around and say, well, we don't want to adhere to the ICC principles when they try to use the same principles on issues that they are passionate about, like Israel and Palestine. So you can't have your cake and eat it. The ICC is extremely important when it comes to international justice. Yes, we know Amnesty as an organization has been the first ones to criticize the ICC and really call on what we call double standards. We know that there are problems in the ICC, but that does not mean, Tabo, that we literally throw away what is an important institution. We should actually be trying to reform it. And those that are signatories should try to reform it from the inside. But South Africa's obligations at this point in time are clear. They are obliged to arrest Putin should he come into the country and hand him over to the ICC. There is no other option for South Africa. And I think it's going to be very interesting to see what the court does with the argument that the president has put forward.
It's very interesting, and I suppose he's going to push this particular angle of declaring war on Russia. It's not new. The ANC has said it previously. But my other question for you, when it comes to motions of war, are they within the reach of judicial review? I mean, can the court say, well, we can review this, there will be no war? Or is that something that is really the confines of the president and his security forces who would be looking at issues of risk of war?
Well, I think, Tabo, it's a really interesting question that you ask. I mean, is the court actually able to review this and take this on as a solid argument for South Africa not conforming or not, doing what is required of it under international law, because they are afraid that, a country that is in violation of international law is going to declare war on South Africa. I mean, courts are legal places. They're places that deal with law, including international law. So it's a very interesting question as to whether or not the court will even, accept this as an argument, because, I mean, it's basically the president's words saying, well, we've been told that if we arrest Putin, then, it's a declaration of war. But the court is there to deal with issues of law, with issues of legislation, with domestic law, with international law. And I think that, that's going to be really, for me, what is going to be the determining factor. So, is a declaration of war part of what the court is going to be able to determine? Is that a good enough reason for a country to violate its own laws and its international obligations? That remains to be seen on how the court actually accepts this argument.
Interesting. Yeah, indeed. Look forward to that Friday argument in court. Is going to be playing out in an open court. The Executive Director for Amnesty International South Africa, Shenilla Mohamed, admitted as friends of the court.